Human beings have been creating culture for tens of thousands of years, but written history, that's only been around for a tiny slice of that time. For most of our existence, there were no books, no recorded laws, no written instructions for how to live together. And yet somehow people still learned the rules of life. So how did that happen? The answer lies in something older than writing stories, symbols, and the quiet ways human beings learn from one another, long before anything is ever written down. Imagine trying to build a culture without writing. No books to store knowledge, no recorded rules, no instructions passed down on paper from one generation to the next. And yet, for most of human history, that's exactly how people lived. For tens of thousands of years, culture had to move from mind to mind the old-fashioned way through stories, symbols, and shared experience. Long before anyone could write down a law or a philosophy, people still had to understand something essential: how to live together, how to face the unknown world around them, and how to make sense of forces they could barely control. And the strange thing is, the human mind was already built for this task. Our brains are wired first and foremost for social life. Almost everything we learn early on happens through relationships. We understand intention, emotion, trust, betrayal, cooperation, all through interactions with other people. Those are the patterns our minds recognize most naturally. So when human beings began trying to make sense of the wider world, the storms, the dangers, the mysteries of life and death, they didn't interpret it in mechanical terms. They interpreted it socially. The same mental tools used to understand other people became the tools used to understand existence itself. In other words, the world began to appear not just as a collection of objects, but as a set of forces with personalities, intentions, and roles. This is where the great symbolic patterns of culture began to emerge. One of the most ancient of these patterns centers on the unknown itself. Think about the unknown for a moment, the unexplored territory, the future, the unpredictable forces that constantly surround human life. It's the place where new things come from, new discoveries, new dangers, new opportunities. Everything that has not yet taken shape lies there. Across cultures, that mysterious background of existence was often symbolized in feminine form. Not because of biology alone, but because of the deeper association with generation with the bringing forth of new life. The unknown was imagined as the great source from which all things emerge, a kind of creative background to existence itself. But human beings didn't just face the unknown. They also carried something else with them, the weight of everything that had already been learned. Every generation inherits the past. Customs, rules, rituals, habits of behavior, patterns that were slowly shaped through countless lives and countless mistakes. These traditions helped people navigate uncertainty. They provided ways of acting when the future was unclear. And symbolically, this accumulated wisdom often took the form of the father figure. The father represented structure, memory, the authority of what had worked before. Through parents, especially through modeled behavior, the lessons of the past were transmitted into the present. Children learned how to act, how to speak, how to interpret the world by absorbing these patterns long before they could consciously explain them. So in a symbolic sense, human life unfolded between two great forces. On one side, the unknown, the mysterious source of new possibilities. On the other side, tradition, the accumulated knowledge that allowed people to face that uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. And somewhere between those two forces, culture was born. A living system of symbols and stories that helped human beings bring order to a world that might otherwise have felt impossibly chaotic. Now imagine two strangers meeting for the first time. Neither of them knows the other personally. They have no shared memories, no personal history. And yet, almost immediately, they can begin to interact with a surprising level of confidence. They know how to greet one another. They know roughly how conversations should flow. They can often guess what behavior will be considered respectful and what might cause offense. How is that possible? The answer is culture. Long before any individual enters the world, there are already patterns waiting. Ways of speaking, ways of behaving, expectations about how people should act in different situations. These patterns are not invented fresh by every generation. They are inherited. In a very real sense, each person steps into a set of shared routines that have been shaped over centuries. And those routines do something extremely important. They make human life predictable. If two people share the same cultural framework, if they're playing the same social game, so to speak, then they can anticipate each other's responses. When one person speaks, the other more or less knows how to reply. When one person expresses a goal, the other can often understand why that goal matters. This predictability is not trivial. It's the foundation of trust. Because if you can predict how someone will behave, then you can begin to rely on them. And if you can rely on them, cooperation becomes possible. Think about something as simple as standing in line. Everyone understands the rule without needing it explained. People wait their turn. They respect the invisible order of the queue. No one needs to negotiate the rules from scratch. Or consider rituals, family traditions, social customs, ceremonies, even everyday routines like greeting a coworker in the morning. These patterns create a shared structure that allows people to move through life together without constant confusion. In a sense, culture acts like a protective framework. It shelters individuals from the overwhelming uncertainty of the world. Instead of facing every situation as if it were completely new, people rely on inherited patterns that guide their actions. Those patterns allow individuals to coordinate with one another in ways that would otherwise be impossible. But here's where the story becomes more complicated, because the very thing that protects people also constrains them. Every cultural rule carries an expectation behind it. If you follow the rule, you belong. If you break it, there are consequences. Sometimes those consequences are subtle. A raised eyebrow, a laugh from a group of peers, the quiet feeling that you've stepped outside what's acceptable. Anyone who has ever been a teenager knows this feeling well. Something as simple as wearing the wrong clothes, using the wrong slang, or ignoring a social expectation can suddenly place you outside the circle. And those pressures are not accidental. They are part of how culture maintains itself. Shared structures require a certain level of obedience. If everyone constantly ignored the rules, the patterns that make cooperation possible would dissolve. So tradition carries a strange dual nature. On one hand, it shelters people. It gives them the accumulated wisdom of the past and allows them to navigate life without starting from chaos. On the other hand, it quietly demands conformity. It asks individuals to step into patterns that already exist, even when those patterns limit who they might otherwise become. If you look back across the long history of human cultures, something interesting begins to appear. Again and again, societies tried to represent the structure that holds their world together, not just with laws or customs, but with images and stories powerful enough to capture something deeper. One of the most common images is surprisingly simple: a ruler standing above a city. In many ancient artworks and religious depictions, you see this figure watching over a community, calm, upright, often illuminated by the sun or surrounded by symbols of authority. At first glance, it might just look like a king or perhaps a divine figure, but symbolically, it represents something larger than any individual person. It represents order itself. The idea behind this image is that human life only becomes possible when chaos is held back by structure. Cities exist because people agree to follow rules. Families function because there are patterns of responsibility and care. Communities survive because individuals coordinate their actions under shared principles. The ruler in these images becomes a symbolic father, a representation of the accumulated wisdom and authority that organizes society. He stands above the city, not simply as a person in charge, but as the embodiment of the moral and cultural framework that allows that city to exist at all. The laws, traditions, and expectations that hold people together are gathered into that single figure. Behind him, in many traditional images, you often find another symbol quietly present: the sun. The sun represents illumination and consciousness. It's the source of life, the force that makes the world visible during the day. In symbolic terms, it reflects the idea that order brings clarity. It allows people to see where they are, what they should do, and how they should live together. But this symbolic father figure has two very different faces. On one side, he appears as the wise king. This is the ruler who listens, who governs with fairness, who protects the community, while remaining open to those who seek guidance. In traditional images, he often sits calmly holding symbols of responsibility, suggesting that his authority exists not for domination, but for the stability of the world he oversees. Under a wise ruler, order becomes something protective. It creates space where people can live, build, speak, and cooperate without constantly fearing chaos. But the same structure can also take on a darker form, because authority once established can become rigid. Instead of protecting society, it can begin to demand absolute obedience. Instead of allowing creativity, it may try to suppress it. This is the other face of the father figure, the tyrannical ruler. In many myths and stories, this darker king appears as the one who fears change, who crushes individuality, who treats stability as more important than the people it was meant to serve. And so the image of order standing above the city carries an uncomfortable truth. The structure that protects society from chaos is also powerful enough to dominate it. Human cultures have always understood this tension. The same force that shelters the world can, if it grows too rigid, begin to suffocate the very life it was meant to protect. There's a quiet truth about growing up that most people only begin to feel much later in life. When you're young, the future seems wide open. You could become almost anything: a musician, a scientist, a traveler, a builder of something entirely new. Every direction appears possible at once, like a landscape with 1,000 branching paths. But slowly, almost without noticing it, something begins to change. Choices get made, habits form, skills develop in some areas and not in others. Certain doors open while others quietly close behind you. What once felt like limitless potential gradually becomes a more defined shape, a particular life moving in a particular direction. And there's something both necessary and painful about that process, because becoming someone always means no longer being many other things. Part of this narrowing happens socially. As people grow up, they absorb the expectations and structures of the culture around them. Families, schools, communities, all of these systems gently guide individuals towards certain roles. You learn how to behave, what goals matter, what paths are considered realistic. Little by little, you begin to take on a specific place within the larger social world. But the process runs deeper than social pressure alone. It's built into the very structure of human development. At the beginning of life, the brain is astonishingly open. In fact, newborns actually possess more neural connections than they will have at any other time in their lives. The brain begins with an enormous abundance of possible pathways, an almost overwhelming number of ways the mind could potentially organize itself. But those possibilities don't remain forever. As a child grows, experience begins to shape the brain. Circuits that are used repeatedly become stronger. Pathways that prove useful are reinforced again and again through learning and interaction with the world. At the same time, something else happens. The connections that are not used begin to disappear. This process is sometimes described as pruning. The brain gradually eliminates excess circuits, leaving behind the ones that support the patterns of thought, behavior, and perception that have actually been practiced. So the person you become is not simply built by adding new abilities. It's also shaped by a quiet process of loss. Unused possibilities fade away. In a sense, experience carves a path through the vast landscape of what you might have been. Every decision, every habit, every skill practiced over time strengthens one direction while weakening countless others. By the time adulthood arrives, the structure of that path is much clearer. The brain itself has adapted to the life you've lived, reinforcing certain ways of thinking and acting until they become second nature. And that's part of why the passage of time feels so strange. On one hand, life often climbs upward. People accumulate knowledge, competence, and responsibility. They reach heights that would have seemed impossible earlier in life. But on the other hand, the road forward becomes narrower. The number of possible directions shrinks. And somewhere deep inside, many people feel that tension. The awareness that the person they are now is only one version of the countless lives they might once have lived. Becoming something, it turns out, always means letting many other possibilities fall away. If you watch closely, there's a moment that appears in almost every generation. It usually arrives somewhere in adolescence or early adulthood, a time when the world that once seemed stable suddenly starts to feel restrictive. The rules are still there. The expectations are still there. But now they feel different. Instead of looking like guidance, they begin to look like limitations. Young people start asking questions that earlier never seemed necessary. Why should things be done this way? Why does this structure exist? Who decided these rules in the first place? And very often, those questions turn into resistance. Large institutions begin to look suspicious. Governments, corporations, universities, military systems, cultural traditions, these structures can appear less like guardians of order and more like machines demanding obedience. To someone just beginning to define their own identity, that feeling can be deeply unsettling. Because these systems don't just organize society, they also shape the lives of individuals within them. They set boundaries, they define acceptable behavior. They tell people sometimes quite bluntly what kind of person they are expected to become. And for someone who is only just discovering who they might be, that pressure can feel suffocating. So rebellion begins to make sense. Across cultures and across generations, young people push back against the structures that surround them. They question authority. They challenge traditions. They criticize institutions that seem too large, too rigid, too impersonal. At first glance, this rebellion might look purely destructive. But in many ways, it's a deeply human response. Because young people are often the first to sense when a system has become too rigid. When the structures meant to organize life begin to crush individuality instead of supporting it. When order stops serving people and begins demanding their submission. And yet, there's another side to the story. Those same structures exist for a reason. Without shared rules, society quickly falls apart. If every individual acted purely on impulse, cooperation would become nearly impossible. Trust would disappear. Agreements would mean nothing. The result would not be freedom in its pure form. It would be conflict. A world where every person struggles against every other person just to survive. So the structures that young people question, the institutions, the traditions, the systems of authority, are also the frameworks that make social life possible in the first place. And that's where the real tension appears. Human beings want two things at the same time. They want freedom, the ability to shape their own lives and express their individuality. But they also need order, the shared patterns that allow millions of strangers to live together without descending into chaos. That conflict never fully disappears. Every generation inherits it, and every young person at some point has to face the same difficult question. How much structure is necessary, and how much is too much? For thousands of years, human cultures explained the tension between freedom and order through myths and symbols. Stories about gods, kings, chaos, and authority tried to capture something real about the human experience. Then much later, a different kind of language appeared. Psychological language. Sigmund Freud was one of the thinkers who tried to reinterpret these ancient patterns in more modern terms. Instead of speaking about divine figures or mythic rulers, he described the conflict as something happening inside the human mind itself. In Freud's view, human beings are pulled between three forces. At the base of it all lies the id. The id represents the raw impulses that arise from our biological nature. Hunger, aggression, sexuality, curiosity. The urge to explore, the impulse to act without restraint. These drives emerge from the deeper layers of the mind, the part that is closest to our animal origins. But human life doesn't unfold in isolation. People must live with others, and the moment individuals begin sharing space, impulses have to be regulated. That's where the superego enters the picture. The superego represents the internal voice of social order. It's the collection of rules, prohibitions, and expectations that society places on the individual. Over time, these rules become internalized. They turn into a moral authority inside the mind, constantly reminding a person what they should and should not do. Between these two forces sits the ego. The ego is the part of the mind trying to navigate reality. It stands between the raw impulses of the ID and the moral demands of the superego, attempting to find a way for a person to live in the world without either chaos or complete repression. And according to Freud, this balancing act is never easy. Because the superego is rarely gentle. Its voice often sounds like a constant series of restrictions. Don't do that, don't say that, don't behave that way. You can actually see this process unfold very clearly in childhood. Anyone who has spent time around young children knows how powerful their impulses can be. When children are excited or playful, They move with a kind of unstoppable energy. They run, shout, climb, grab, laugh loudly, and throw themselves fully into whatever game they've invented. But the world around them doesn't always welcome that level of chaos. So adults follow closely behind, repeating the same message again and again. No, don't do that. Slow down. Quiet down. Be careful. What's being taught in those moments isn't just politeness or discipline. It's the gradual shaping of the child's impulses so they can function inside a social world. And that shaping doesn't apply only to aggression or sexuality. It also reaches into playfulness, creativity, spontaneity, the joyful, unpredictable energy that makes childhood so alive. According to Freud, learning to live within society always involves that trade-off. Some impulses must be restrained so that life with others becomes possible. If you watch children carefully, you can actually see culture being built right in front of you. It doesn't begin with lectures or formal lessons. It begins with imitation. Children are constantly studying the adults around them. They watch how people speak, how they move, how they solve problems, how they react when something goes wrong. And before long, those observations start to appear in their play. A child might suddenly announce that they are the mother or the father or the teacher. They imitate the tone of voice they've heard, repeat phrases they've absorbed, and begin organizing their little world according to the roles they've seen in the real one. At first, it might look like simple imagination, but something much deeper is happening. Through this kind of role-playing, children are gradually pulling the structure of the social world inside themselves. They are experimenting with authority, responsibility, and order. They are learning what it means to guide, to care, to correct, and sometimes even to enforce rules. The role of the father is especially powerful in this process. Not necessarily the individual father alone, but the broader pattern that the role represents. The figure who establishes boundaries, sets expectations, protects what matters, and helps organize the chaos of daily life. Children watch this pattern carefully, and then through play, they begin to practice it themselves. They try on the role the way someone might try on a set of clothes that's still a little too large. They test what it feels like to give instructions, to create rules, to hold things together. Little by little, the lessons of the surrounding culture move from the outside world into the inner structure of the child's mind. And over time, those borrowed roles slowly become part of who that child grows up to be. In the end, every human life unfolds inside the same quiet tension. We want the freedom to become ourselves, yet we also rely on the structures that make life with others possible. Too much order can crush the individual. Too little can pull everything apart. So each of us walks that narrow line between chaos and responsibility, discovery and tradition. It's an ancient balance every generation must rediscover. If these ideas made you pause and think, consider staying with the journey like the video and subscribe to keep exploring.